Hi, everyone. My name is Ongezwa, and I'll be your host today. Welcome to the 25th edition of Poetry Africa. This festival has been made possible by the following partners and funders: the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the National Institute for Humanities and Social Science, French Institute of South Africa, Total Energies, KwaZulu-Natal Department of Arts and Culture. So we gathered today for the book launch of Years of Fire and Ash, South African Poems of Decolonisation, edited by Dr. Wamuwi Mbao. I would like my beautiful people who are our panelists today to actually introduce themselves. Where are you from? Where are you now? And where are you currently in the movement of poetry? Dr. Wamuwi, can you please start us?
Cool, I'll start. My name is Dr. Wamuwi Mbao. I am a lecturer at the University of Stellenbosch, which is where I currently am. My own origin story is rather more complex than that. I am a Zambian who's transplanted his way to South Africa via Mafeking and a few other places along the way. I've been involved in open mic and stage poetry in Stellenbosch in the Western Cape for a few years now. And it is through that experience that I've come to understand the deep diversity of poetry in this country.
Thank you. Sthe, do you want to take it, please?
Thank you for that. So my name is Sthe Khali, or Sithembiso Khalishwayo. I'm born and raised in Joburg, but my family lives in KwaZulu-Natal at Mbele, so that's my hometown. So I'm part of Drum for Life. I'm part of the Drum for Life Theatre Company, and I project manage some projects. Poetry for me right now, in terms of my journey, is an experience that I'm loving. Knowing the importance of words is so beautiful to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Sibongile, do you want to take it?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Sibongile, and I've been a performance poet for pretty much since my teens. I kind of stopped a bit just to focus on myself and my intentionality. I write across many disciplines as well. And now that I've started again performing poetry, I guess that's where I am in my journey now, just reigniting that relationship, with my first love. Cool.
Your first love. Thank you, Sibongile. Vangile, take it.
Vangile gantsho. And I am a poet and a healer and 1/3 of Mbele Press. I think my journey through poetry has been long and very intertwined. It's deeply rooted in my journey towards myself and finding myself in my own home language. So currently, I think I'm trying to find the different expressions of poetry that allow me to explore the different lives that I live in publishing, in spirituality, in motherhood.
Thank you, Vangile, and thank you to our beautiful panelists for introducing yourselves and putting your words and yourselves into this launch of Years of Fire and Ash, South African Poems of Decolonisation. My first question goes to you, Dr. Wamuwi, I must get it right, Wamuwi. Define decolonisation in relation to this book.
So decolonisation, as I see it working through this book, is an organizing tool for addressing the distance between the world as it is now and the world that we'd like to see, the world that we... When we talk about colonization, I think very often you have to contend with a lot of misunderstanding around what the term means and what it stands for, what it's doing in the world. And with Years of Fire and Ash, we were trying to kind of to hone it down and to make sense of it. And also to bring across to people that it's not simply a metaphor. I think that's where a lot of people tend to get lost in thinking about it in very abstract terms. And Years of Fire and Ash, we want to see it as a political project, a kind of praxis for restructuring the world through art and through poetry in particular.
Okay, thank you for that. Vangile, can you just explain to us what does it mean for your poetry movement and how you introduce yourself to contribute to this book that looks at decolonization within the context of South Africa?
Obviously, I think that decolonial work is hugely important. I also think that decolonial work is part of the work that we need to do. And the other part of the work that we need to do is finding our way back to ourselves, and finding pockets of remembering ourselves and remembering who we are. And I think that what this book does so beautifully is that it allows us to be reintroduced to some fantastic writers who have held us together and who've held us true. I mean, it's quite something to be in a book with Peter Abrahams, for example, and to read his work and to know that we now contribute to a lineage that will assist, will help kind of find a way back to ourselves. And by back to ourselves, not in some pre-colonial context, but in a very kind of true and who we really are authentically as particularly Black people. And I think that this is part of the work that does that. And so I feel very honored to be a part of it, actually.
Oh, thank you, Vangile. Thank you. I'll go back to Udokotela Wamuwi, because it's interesting how you've organized the book. So and so please just briefly speak to us about the table of content and of the book and the timelines which Uvangile touches on. Why did you choose to actually organize the book and structure it like this?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I think that it was very important for me when we were putting this together that we would bring across a sense of the long history of this process called decolonization, that it's not simply something that arrived overnight and suddenly from nowhere. And in that sense, having the older poets and the older poems that then make up the sort of starting point of the collection, and constructing a timeline that allows us to then see that, okay, this is something where there's commonality, even though the specific areas might be slightly different. There's conversation going on between poems from different ages. That was very much the idea behind having this kind of structure or timeline that proceeds sort of from the early to early mid 20th century through to the present day. To have a sense of this continuity of thematic, a continuity of project in the work, and that's what we did.
Thank you. Sibongile, can you speak then to how you contributing to this continuity of the decolonization project means for you and your poetry?
Cool. So I think firstly for me, the collection does obviously excite my 16-year-old self, who barely, if ever, found poetry by Black writers in the libraries. So firstly, this for me, I see it, this timeline, this lineage that Vangile speaks about, this continuity that Dr. Mbao speaks about. For me, I see it as an inheritance, as a way to also archive our existence and to say that there are those who were there before us, because oftentimes that intergenerational conversation between artists is not really there. And you find that in this book. And I think for me, that's one of the things that it means a lot. But also, I know that there's a 16-year-old out there who potentially as well will pick up this copy in the libraries and actually realize that they're not muted, because if you don't have access to, which is in par actually with the theme of the festival, but if you don't have access to institutions of higher education where these archives of our history are buried beneath like bureaucracy and stuff, you tend to think that there isn't much that has been written, or people weren't held accountable through art. And so this, for me, this book also speaks a little bit to that access and to giving that access to not just myself or people who predecessors of poetry, poets who came before me, but also to like those who will come after me. So for me, it's like a blueprint of some sort. Yeah.
A blueprint of some sort. I like that. Sthe, can you please speak about the process of you coming to choose these words that are published in the years of fire and ash, South African Poems of Decolonisation? I have to repeat it all the time. Like it gives me that fire every time. Let me behave. But I want to know how did you write for the intentionally write for the book, or did you choose, and why did you actually gather these words and contribute these words for the book?
Thank you for that. So I actually wrote this poem between my honors and my master's degree, and that's when Fees Must Fall was happening. And there was a lot, especially if you look at the educational space. How do we decolonize the educational space? And the key thing for me was finding the forgotten voices. So in terms of the movement, who's that child that's not being heard? Who's that voice that's not being appreciated? And for me, that was quite important. So being able to hear from people, being able to talk to people, being able to have workshops with people, saying, I want to talk about this, I want to say this, but I can't because the space doesn't allow me, even though we're fighting the same battle. And I think that was the key thing for me. That's what's very important for me in terms of my words and my work.
Thank you, Sthe. Can you read your poem? I think that would be just a beautiful intro to what you've just said, or embellish even more. Just say.
So I'm going to read a part of my poem, and it's called The Forgotten. My name was meant to be 0962785. It was the name I was meant to be given on the first day that I entered through those gates, signed some forms, attached a card to myself, and walked through the hallways of education. Step up from yesterday and enter into today. That day never happened. The gates were closed. They told me that they were fighting for free education for all. I think they forgot about me when they shouted from the rooftops. They created a story before my voice was even heard. I guess I have to tell my story to you, if you're willing to listen.
I mean, I think at the heart of it, it's, Fees Must Fall was a cry for for students to be seen. And you capture this so well, like, can you listen to me, right? And I want, and Vangile, I'd like you to engage also after Udogotela has answered this question. What were the intersections between FISMAS 4 and decolonization that awakened this continuity of history that you capture in the timelines of the book?
Thank you. Again, a lovely question. I think that when we were in the midst of the fallist years, you know, that time period, and of course, I mean, it hasn't ended now, so I can't really call it a time period. When we were in the throng of those initial years, the 2015, 16s and so on, there was a sense that, you know, something quite important was happening. I think if you were on a university campus or in any of the centers of South Africa where these events were taking place, you could feel that there was something happening in the air. And I think many of us didn't necessarily know quite what to call it or how to make sense of it or how to put it into context, you know. And we saw that in the media a lot of the time, that it was being presented as though it was this new thing, as though it was an explosion that had come from nowhere. And I think it was then, you know, this sense of a desire to kind of historicize it, to place it in a context, to see, like, this isn't just people being angry, this is something which comes out of a very long history, which led us down the route of putting this collection together. And hearing some of the incredibly incendiary voices, seeing some of the incredibly explosive poetry that was coming out of that time period. And Sithembiso's poem is a wonderful example in that regard. I think I felt a sense that we needed to connect that to, you know, like some of the militant poetry of our past, to show that actually this has been something which has been ongoing and progressing in a particular way. And it speaks to the same sorts of concerns, even if the specific contexts might be slightly different. There's a long history, I keep going back to that term, that, you know, I felt we needed to draw out. And I think that when you put these poems together, you know, when you read, you know, these poems around Fees Must Fall and so on, and you place them against, you know, the poetry of the Soweto years, you definitely see these resonances. A sense of people feeling that they haven't been heard, that their voices are drowned out, that they are being ignored or mistreated, and that they need a way to express themselves. And very often poetry becomes that very powerful vehicle for doing that. You can reach a crowd through poetry in ways that you can't necessarily do with other forms of art, or not in the same way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And so Vangile, the question, I'm going to articulate it differently for you. So, because I want you to think back on the time that this Fees Must Fall was happening or had arrived, which is a continuation, because, you know, I'm at UKZN. Now we're Fees Must Falling for before, until, you know, the institutions started to Fees Must Fall. You know, people are like, we've been doing this, right? So where were you at? So memory-wise, because memory is an archive, where were you at in your life? And if you look back now, or if you look, what does Fees Must Fall and decolonization and Vangile realizing, right? And this notion of what you say, we trying to gather us. I'm paraphrasing you. We're trying to find ourselves, not as purity, as pre-colonial, but that complex and nuanceness of existence, right? And if you can just flesh out this question, it's quite for me, or comment for me, in relation, without leaving Fees Must Fall, right, behind, in the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked this question because it does require me to reflect a bit. The poem I submitted was written during 2016 while I was doing my MA at the university currently known as Rhodes. And at the time, it was, I mean, so much was happening. There was the fees must fall, but there was also the RU reference list. And so for me, it was also the beginning of my spiritual homecoming. So Benkalu Tonga, Benkalu Chisimpepe, Benkalu abantu abadala were starting to finally get through to me in ways that they hadn't been able to in the past. And so what was happening was that everything was vibrating so loud and so hard. And it was intergenerational, and I could feel it, and I was trying to find different ways of articulating this. Why is my grandmother, and I don't know my maternal grandmother, but why is she coming up so much? Why is she angry? Why is there so much blood? And not just obviously because we have a history of blood and violence, but also there is unspoken for blood, and there is an energy of our children cannot still be going through this. This is not like as in aswazba sibesise lapha. And I think I was also coming out of a phase of being deeply conventionally politically active, in that like I was no longer an active member of the ANC. I was no longer wanting to perform I expect more from you, not because I wasn't feeling all of this, but because my politics had become so deeply personal. And I think that being in the heart of RU reference list and having to face how much sexual trauma our bodies as Black women carry in this country, and what violence our bodies know. I was trying to find my way through that, in a way that kind of really wanted to heal it. I wasn't so much worried about articulating it so that other people could understand it. I wanted to understand it and feel it and touch it and find a way of healing it for myself, I think.
Thank you for your vulnerability. Can you read the poem?
I'll read a part of the poem, I think,
Yes.
because it's a bit of a long poem, but
okay.
So it's called Clots of Blood, and it was written after Hiromo Ito's Coyote. My grandmother was a teacher. My mother was a healer. My mother's younger sister was a Christian. My mother's other younger sister had a paralyzed daughter. All were wonderfully beautiful. When I was born, my grandmother sent a telegram with my name. She saw me in a dream. My grandmother saw herself reborn through my mother. And then I'll skip to the end.
Okay.
My grandmother was touched by my father's younger brother. My mother was touched by my mother's sister's husband. My mother's younger sister was also touched by her mother's sister's husband. My mother's younger sister was touched by her mother's uncle. My mother had always wanted a daughter. She never left me alone with any of her sister's husbands. The protection my mother gave me was the Bible, fear, and chastity. We were all afraid of God, men, and the dark.
Enkosi, ne? I mean, and I'll go back to reflect about yesterday and the words of the welcome. Just you know, about the freedom to offend, right? That when you speak truth and you speak about fear but then the where vulnerability is about being fearless with poets. this notion of unmuting yourself, and how we are birthed in these moments, right? Even this panel is I can feel it, right? I can feel your words, and thank you. So Sibongile, I'll go to you. And you spoke about your 16-year-old self. And I want, just for this project of this book, evoke her to speak in relation to this book, if you can. In a way, what would she think at this point, right? Here you are published in the anthology of Years of Fire and Ash, South African Poems of Decolonisation. And I ask this question because there's what comes out from the book is, and your contribution is, this notion of not leaving yourself behind, right? Yeah, I'll just, before we go more, because you guys are evoking the spirit in me. Sibongile, can you engage that question?
Thank you, Ongezwa. I think it'll be a little bit difficult to invoke the 16-year-old me because I'm a completely different person from what I was when I was 16, beaded-eyed and you know, believed that the world is my oyster, and quickly you grow to find that it's quite different. But I actually, like, there's something that Vangile touched on that I think is very, very pertinent, and it's a very, very important discussion, and it's around the violence that our bodies know and that our bodies carry, and how that becomes the inheritance to our children, you know, and their children's children, and it becomes that legacy. And I think quite what's done very well in this book for me is that accountability, you know, that prevalent theme of accountability, where even though Dr. Mbao spoke about these voices that are neglected, are not heard, and just want to be heard, but they're not only holding the oppressor accountable, but also holding ourselves, you know, accountable. And for me, I think it's quite a very, very important thing, because what Vangile speaks about is, it's a simple thing of, if we unmute our experiences to our children, then we can quickly avoid passing down that fear, you know, that she touches on, but more understanding. So how I look at it is, now that I'm a mother myself, there are a lot of things that I didn't understand about how my mother chose to parent me because of her experiences that she didn't share with me. But now that I'm a mother and we're starting to have those conversations, and those experiences are starting to come out without shame, I'm starting to understand that what she thought was instilling respect is actually instilling fear. What she thought was actually protection is actually oppression. So where do we draw the lines there? And I think that those conversations that this book sparks for me and my 16-year-old self, hopefully, which I can't speak for, but I think for me, that's what's important. It's that those personal politics that Vanki spoke about, because I think when you've been very political, either through your art or through your work, that you do tend to get political fatigue, and you do tend to become apolitical at some point, and then you quickly realize that this decolonization, this revolution is not this outward thing or this theoretic thing that's in academic corridors, but it's actually a way of life that's within you, that you have the control, you know, to change and affect. And I think for me, that's what this book touches on, but also the various struggles in the different periods, and how quickly the cloak of oppressor moves from one person to the other, you know. It's easy during the apartheid period to point at who was the oppressor then, you know, and then to post-apartheid who's the oppressor then, and then to now where we are, where gender-based violence it's a pandemic on its own. So I think for me also, like when you read through this book, you get to see how quickly that cloak can be passed on from one person to the next. And it begs you to then do that inquiry within yourself and ask yourselves those difficult questions in terms of how are you contributing, whether actively or passively, to the problems of this country.
Thank you, Sibongile. Don't mute yourself, unmute. Mute yourself. Can you please read your poem for us, to us?
No problem, I will do that. So I wrote this poem in 2017. And well, just to give a little bit of context before I get into it, is oftentimes there's arguments between whether the ocean is masculine or feminine, but I see it as feminine because as much as the ocean can build and hold life, it can easily destroy if it is enraged. And so I wanted to look at that and use that as a running metaphor in this piece, which speaks to gender-based violence. The ocean seeks revenge. What licks at death like the common tongue brushing against headlines? A woman in South Africa or her son in the US of A? What bites at their fate like bad teeth born on the wrong side of the tracks? A black man, a white man, or the unprefixed reality that men are landmines buried beneath the lust of power, and the rest of us have to walk this earth trying to avoid them. But we can't unmother them, unlove them, unfriend them. So we make humans of monsters, make lovers of fraudsters, make friends of swindlers, until death gropes us with their hands. Then we are enraged, pull the ocean over our eyes and seek revenge. But here, the ocean is not heard, not seen for anything else outside its beauty, a home for the living, a home for the spirits, the Genesis that broke the lands and gave it life. When will it end? The breathing in the coffins, the loving in the mortuaries, the carrying in the horror films. Will it end when the ocean finally seeks revenge?
Thanks, Sibongile. Yes, you know, it's this, we are oceans apart. With the US, right? And so you mentioned also the sun in the US, and my image is of George Floyd, you know, during lockdown, and the parallels also of this violence, right? And I want to get the guy that got killed by the soldiers. I want to get his name right because I can see his face, but I just don't have his name right now. In Joburg during lockdown, right? So there's this relentless violence, right? This ongoing culture of violence. But with your poems, you seem to archive it, but also resist it, right? Or disrupt it. And I want to ask Sthe, where do you source that courage to do that? Because I mean, Sibongile does what Sibongile speaks about so beautifully is this political fatigue, and it's diniwe, it's katele, it's digiwe during COVID, right? And rightfully so. And now we must vote, and people. I'm, you know, I can go on. You got my questions, Sthe. You got me. It's all, thank you.
Yeah, it's very crazy, like just being even an activist, because you do reach that point of, I'm tired, I'm done, I have to be doing this and that, I have to be fighting for this and that, and that's the hardest part. I think as a writer, being able to be vulnerable and being able to say to yourself, you know what, my words actually matter. I think is something quite key. And I think we sit in a place of privilege that we can actually have our poems published in a book. You know, a lot of people don't have that opportunity. I remember, like, I think it was only in high school that I realized like books and certain songs were banned. I'm like, is that where we came from? That we keep on muting and muting ourselves. And as soon as someone speaks out, there's a backlash. So I think the thing for me is around what's the importance of our voices in this present moment in time? What is the importance of our voices back in the days? And what's going to be the importance of our voices in the future? I think that's what we need to be considering. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Mbao, thank you, Sthe. So then the question follows, and it's evoked. This is my evoked by Sthe. So what are you hoping that this book does for the future? Right? And you do this timeline. And I'm actually, because I'm obsessed with the table of content, I'll read how you've done it so people can actually hear it. Okay, because you do this timeline, and we know that time is not linear, especially within the African context, right? So even when we talk about the future, it's, yeah, please answer the question. I'm making the question quite nuanced a bit.
No, it's a great question. I think my hope is that when with these poems that we've gathered together, you know, and of course in saying that I must just briefly pay tribute to the poets who, you know, gave in their poetry, who contributed to this work. You know, I keep trying to push myself into the background of this, because even though my name's on the cover, it's very much a collective gathering, and it wouldn't have been possible without the tremendous generosity of the poets, Sibongile, Vangile, Sthe, and others who really, you know, came together when I harassed them for poetry, and really just contributed these fantastic, magnificent works that come together so wonderfully. I think when we talk about futurity, I think that my sense is that you have an idea of poetry as something that endures beyond its moment, especially if you can capture it. And my preoccupation initially when we were putting this collection together was looking at a lot of the poetry that was around Fees Must Fall and going like, how do we capture some of this stuff that's not getting recorded in anthologies, that's not getting, you know, put down in print? You know, some of it might be on YouTube, some of it might be, you know, on Facebook pages or wherever. And how do we, you know, pay tribute to that moment as something which has a duration beyond its immediate self, beyond its immediate moment? And I hope that with this collection of what we've put together, we have something that, you know, people will be able to look at now or in 3 years or 10 years time and say, you know, this speaks to a distinctly South African moment, but it also speaks to a distinctly worldwide moment, as Sibongile was pointing to, you know, that these are conversations that extend out into the world and extend out in a way that defeats, you know, any attempt to kind of lock it down to one particular place. So even if these are South African poems of decolonization, they speak to like a worldwide moment that we're all in the grip of, and that's not going to go away from us at any point in time for the future. So that's it, I think. My hope is that this will be like a reference text that people can look to and go, you know, here is what the artists say about this moment that we're living through.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone out there. We are live at the Poetry Africa Festival, the 25th edition. If you've got any questions for my beautiful panelists, beautiful poets and writers. And if you want to just engage them even further, please pop your questions in the chat and I'll read them out to them. And if you have any comments, please share also. I want to go back also, not go back, but I want to, so you've kind of chosen, Dr. Wamuwi, you've chosen certain events in South African history, right? In how you've organized the poems, right? You've said pre-Sharpeville, post-Sharpeville, post-Soweto, and you said present day, you know, and why those events specifically for the decolonization project, for the decolonial project. Why those events?
Thank you. Again, that's an interesting question. It's one where I agonized for ages over what kind of rubrics to organize a poetry under. You know, I think historically we've begun to move away from this idea of, you know, the very neat kind of timeline, because of course it doesn't work in that way. And I think, you know, we came up with so many potential possibilities, you know, because one timeline is just one way of structuring how people experience the world. You know, there are other timelines that would have been just as interesting to invoke and to use. You know, you could have used the Women's March to Pretoria in the 50s, or you could have used Lily's Leaf Farm and the Rivonia trial, or any of those things as significant kind of touchstones. I think the reason I chose the particular ones that we went with was that they marked scenes of a particularly direct confrontation. And I thought it was then interesting to, if you place that marker down and say, you know, this is Sharpeville, then we say, okay, what happened before this and what happens after this? You know, what is going on around that moment? And so those kind of rubrics, those timelines, are there as a kind of loose historical guide, but also as a way of just gesturing to the fact that wherever you land in the historical picture of South Africa, you know, since South Africa was constituted as a vaguely illegal republic in the 1900s, illegal because of course it didn't involve, you know, the rest of us, the majority of the population, that since that moment happened, you know, wherever you land on the historical timeline, there's always something that you can point to and go, here is an act of decolonization occurring. Here is an act of decolonization being recorded in poetry or being spoken about by an artist, by an artistic presence. But yeah, they proliferated. There were so many that we had to kind of pare them down in the end.
Thank you. I mean, it's interesting because yesterday we had the Mafika Makwala annual lecture, and I feel sometimes there's work that is happening beyond our understanding, especially, and I sense it through poetry. So when I looked at the book again, I was like, there was this, and I mean, when I sent the questions before, I was like, how does it, you know, because I was getting excited with how, and I think Sibongile captures it for me metaphorically in this notion of the ocean and the movement of poetry. This is my interpretation of your poem, and how history, this conversation, this continuity of healing, right? And so I'm gonna go back to you, Sibongile. What does it mean in relation to your poem or your poetry movement, poem that you contributed with, right? What does it mean to really be in conversations with the likes of Mafika Makwala, you know, people who thought you into the future? Because and you can see the work in words, right?
100%. So I was actually trying to type furiously in the chat box. It's as if I knew that it's going to answer the question that you're asking. But I was saying that we often take for granted that dialogue ends wars. Dialogue fosters change, and dialogue gives birth to new ideas, right? And we do this because we're taught that silence guarantees us safety, you know. But these conversations, these intergenerational conversations that are happening with these poems in the book towards each other, you know, like remind us and reinforce that our voice, which is what Sthe touched on earlier, that our voices actually matter. Because at some point you get like, you get so fatigued, even within doing the arts, you know, obviously being taken for granted by various organizations, you get so fatigued that you forget why you do what you do, why you write, because you're compelled to, you know, and you become so tired of that you forget how important it actually is. But when I actually received the copy of the book and I was going through the people who are actually in there, you know, I mean, I was filled with glee, like, and not just the likes of Umafika, but also people who are younger, people who I consider my peers, like vangile, you know, so for me, it was like, actually, it reinforced that firstly I exist, because sometimes I don't think I exist, but it reinforced that you actually exist, you are alive, and that even though you're silent, you're still being heard, you know. And then it reinforced that my voice is important, you know, and it reinforced that the work that was done before and that baton that has been carried over to us is important for us to continue and carry it over to the next generation, you know. No matter how tired we get, we do find ourselves in those who came before us. When we have questions, we go through their work, you know, to seek answers to those questions, and we do find those answers. And so to think that in the next 50 years or so, the next generation will be going through our work, you know, to seek answers for themselves. And I think for me, that it circles back to what Vangi said, because that is exactly where I am in my life at the moment, around personal politics, you know, and how do you personalize that decolonization and that revolution for yourself? How do you seek that healing within yourself? And we know that water remembers, water holds memory. And so for me, water plays a huge part in my work and in the work that I do.
Thank you, Sibongile. Vangile, because you started the conversation about decolonization and healing. Can you just unpack it for us? What does it mean for you, especially?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big question. You know what? You know, one of the things that I noticed in this book is how quiet women are until present day. It's very male heavy. And I guess this is how our history has also been written. And what's interesting is that the women who do write in present day evoke their mothers and grandmothers a lot. And so there's a very strong kind of a desperate need. Obviously we want to be heard, but this lineage, there's a need to make visible the women who came before us. And I think that's happening a lot generally. But it's interesting how this is revealed also in the book, in the poems that were chosen, the poems that were submitted, in the voices that are coming through. You know, the women that Sindiswa Busuku Matese evokes, Manewa Mohale evokes. There's a definite presence of, we're not quiet, we're not silent, we're not quiet, we're here. And I think that for me, there is something very restorative about being in the company of such femmes or such feminine energy, and to write in that time and to be visible with other women is so important, because we've seen how racist, patriarchal, capitalist structures replicate themselves through divide and conquer, through the only, the first. And so there is power in the many, in a sea of women coming forward. And so I think that's one of the things that I'm appreciating, not just in this book, but in the time that we're living in. There is a very strong kind of a brewing storm of small girls coming, and I feel it, I love it, and I relish in it, and I think that that's where our healing, or part of our healing, lies. Because the Black divine feminine has been quiet for so long, and to see it come in surges in different spaces is just, it gives me goosebumps. It makes me very happy, actually. And I think that it restores something intergenerationally within my body and my lineage, and just all around.
Thank you, Vangile. We've got 5 minutes. There's still no comments and questions. I'm enjoying this. Thank you for your words and your reflections. We need to do the PR moment, Dr. Mbao. Where can we get the book? How much is the book? Access.
Well, yeah, wow, fantastic, full house. Yeah, this book is available wherever good books are sold. You can get it from good bookstores, you can get it from Macro, Loot, Take-A-Lot, exclusive books across a wide range of prices as well. You know, so please feel free to shop around, but it is out there in the world. Order it online or go to a physical bookstore. Support a local bookstore, that's always a good idea, but it is out there.
Okay, thank you. Years of Fire and Ash. Actually, I've got one question. Why Years of Fire and Ash? Unpack that title for us a bit. We still have time. I'm enjoying this.
Yeah, we've got a bit of time. So the title, and again, you know, racking my brain when the collection was coming together, trying to put a name on it was such a difficult process. It was, you know, you write down something and you think it's going to stick, but as you add more poems, it becomes something else. And then it came, you know, one day I was looking through one of the poems that we added to the collection relatively late in proceedings. And it's a poem by a writer named Opa Tando Mtimkulu. And it's called 1976. It comes from the very first issue, so volume 1, number 1 of Staff Rider, of course, which is a very famous journal. And it's called 1976. And this poem, which sort of speaks to the sort of bitter legacy of the Soweto moment, the uprising and the killing of students, and the aftermath of that, ends with this line where the poet says, "We do not boast about you, we do not celebrate you, we do not boast about you, years of fire, year of ash." And I read that and I think, you know, we felt this sense that, okay, this is definitely the title, you know, it jumped out. And I think it speaks to, you know, so many things about how you have this sense of you know, a struggle moment, a fiery moment, something which is a moment of destruction, but also a moment of rebirth. I mean, you can draw out the metaphor as much as you like, but a very strong sense that there is something that is being built out of these moments of struggle and destruction and taking down. And that's why we applied that title in the end.
Thank you. Tanya Pretorius says, breathtaking. That's one of the comments. Sthe, I'll just go to you before we close. And you talk about your birthplace a lot in the poem. You know, we didn't read the whole poem. And I want you to just think about what does it mean to archive where you were born in words for the decolonial projects and to reflect your experiences?
Yeah, I think like home is very important to me. And I only get to go home like maybe like once a year. But the experience of just being with family, being able to put your feet on sand, this idea of remembering your history, your legacy, remembering the people that actually brought you into this world. I think that's very key for me. And a lot of my writing is based on those experiences. It's based on my grandmother raising me up. It's based on the love I have for my mother and my sister, because it's always about home. And writing itself is about going back to home because your voice is being heard there. I think that's the only way I can explain it.
Thank you, Sthe. That's enough. So we've come to the end of the book launch of Years of Fire and Ash, South African Poems of Decolonization. Thank you so much for this conversation. It had such depth. Thank you for your vulnerabilities, and thanks for sharing. I have to do the PR moment. This festival, Poetry Africa, the 25th edition, has been brought by the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And we have to thank the following partners and funders: the National Institute for Humanities and Social Science, French Institute of South Africa, Total Energies, KwaZulu-Natal, Department of Arts and Culture. Siyabonga kakhulu for making it possible for us to gather and launch books that are available in good local good stores. Goody. Thank you.